Hello. Welcome to the Pirate History Podcast. My name is Matt. Thank you for listening. The story of Jewish piracy in the West Indies really begins in about 1640. That's when Protestant exiles arrived in the Caribbean and found allies in the Jewish population of Jamaica. However, those Jamaican Jews were already well acquainted with pirates and piracy, and with the other Jews that already practiced it. That tradition began in the Mediterranean, with the Jews from the Iberian diaspora, and with their alliance with the Dutch and the Ottoman pirates of the Barbary coast. This is episode 74, a brief history of the Berbers. The Berber people are traditionally defined as an indigenous group living in North Africa, and that's a fair definition. There is a linguistic and cultural heritage dating back to 10,000 BCE, maybe earlier. Their name, Berber People or the Berbers, probably comes from ancient Sanskrit, and down through Egyptian, it might actually share a deep root with the word barbarian. In Sanskrit, it meant outlander, and it had negative connotations. Those Egyptians might actually have named the Berber people Berbers, outlanders, and then that would have been passed down through Greece and Rome. The Berbers have never really been a single people. The name Berber has always been placed on them by outsiders. They're really a collection of different cultures and different tribal groups. There are Libyans and Numidians and a host of others all throughout the centuries. But their shared culture, their religion and dress and everything that makes up a people, well, most of that is expressed through their common language. The very first records we have of a Proto-Berber language comes from Egypt, but when you look at things like cave paintings and other archaeological evidence, as well as contemporary written records from the Egyptians, they suggest that there was an agricultural seaside civilization by 2000 BCE or so. The Berbers, the people that made up that civilization, dominated North Africa culturally and linguistically, all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the borders of Egypt. However, most of the history of the Berber people has been a history of invasion, of occupation, and of assimilation. Through the 4,000 years since they were in command of North Africa, well, they've proven to be survivors, not just physically surviving, but keeping their language and their culture and their people alive. Even today, Berber is the primary language in some North African nations and the secondary language in others, and movements continue to preserve and separate Berber culture from the cultural domination of other societies. The first culture to invade and dominate the Berbers was the Phoenician people. The Phoenicians were a Levantine people from the eastern Mediterranean. They were one of those cultures that make up the Fertile Crescent, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Phoenicia. The Phoenicians were among the most talented seafarers of their day. Perhaps they were the most talented. Honestly, that's what defines the Phoenicians. Culturally, they weren't that different from the Israelites or any other Levantine civilization, except that they had a fantastic alphabet and writing system, and they understood the sea and sea travel. They traveled all over the Mediterranean. Notably, they traveled to and traded a lot with Greece. That's where they get their name. The Greeks named the Phoenicians after the purple dyes that they traded. They traded with Egypt as well, and with the Latin people on modern-day Italy, and with Iberian Celtic society. But doing all of that from the Levant was difficult, so they set up trading posts to facilitate trade all around the Mediterranean. Most notably was the city founded by a Phoenician woman named Elishat or Elisha. In ancient Phoenician, her name means either god of fire or god of the feminine. Probably it means both. Phoenician and Berber culture were, and still are in some ways, centered around fire and femininity. They seem to have a connected nature in the minds of the Berber people. The Romans named this fire goddess Queen Dido, and the city she founded was called Carthage. Dido was the grand niece of Jezebel, of biblical fame, and a queen of the great city of Tyre. It's from there that she took her fleet west to settle a new city to dominate, Mediterranean trade. Now, there is a possible connection here. The Phoenicians were, in many ways, a feminine society, at least in the eyes of Rome and compared to Rome, who was a decidedly masculine society. Jezebel and Dido were the lineage of Phoenicia and of Carthage. The Carthaginians and the Phoenicians were masters of the sea. There may have been a connection in the minds of the Romans between the femininity of Carthage and the sea itself. That might explain some of the roots of why, in the European tradition, the sea is always female and ships are always given feminine pronouns. Carthage, according to Roman and biblical sources, was founded sometime around 1200 BCE and immediately became the primary power in the Western Mediterranean. That would, if the city were in fact as old as that, make Carthage a contemporary of Troy and the Hittite Empire and the Minoan civilization on Crete that would predate Assyria and Persia and Athens. However, that's according to biblical sources and much later Roman chroniclers. Archaeological records suggest that the city was founded much later, around 800 BCE. That's right about the time that legend tells us of Romulus and Remus founding the city of Rome. Now, the Phoenicians and Carthage operated differently than the Romans or the Greeks or the Persians. They were a commercial people, and Carthage was a commercial city. They were distinct from the neighboring Berber people. They traded with the Libyans, who was the closest tribe to them, but the citizens of Carthage were an economic elite. They didn't seek expansionist aims in North Africa. Occasionally they would set up other trading posts, but they didn't try to conquer the Libyan people. Instead, they set up other trading posts all around the Mediterranean, in Greece, in Sicily, in Iberia, and in mainland Italy. She was frequently in conflict with the Greek and Etruscan city-states, and when Persia finally began their climb to empire, those old Phoenician centers of power, places like Tyre, well, they fell. Phoenician cultural hegemony transferred from the Levant to North Africa, to Carthage. And it's in that fall, in the fall of the Levantine civilizations to Persia, that we see the roots of Cilician piracy. Dispossessed Phoenician and Israeli seafarers turned to roving, but we're talking about Carthage here. In 509 BCE, Carthage signed a treaty with an insignificant backwater that called itself Roma. They did so to aid themselves in their fight against the Etruscan city-states on the Italian mainland. But that treaty, and their relationship with Rome, would eventually lead to the destruction of Carthage. And when I think about the greatest what-ifs of history, the one that always strikes me as having the greatest potential influence is, well, what if Carthage won the Punic Wars? That's a hard question to answer. So many things would be different throughout our entire history that the modern world might look entirely unrecognizable. And part of the reason that question is so hard to answer is because when Rome finally defeated Carthage for the final time, well, they destroyed her. They destroyed her buildings and her fields and her historical records. Nearly everything that we know of Carthaginian culture comes from the records of Roman historians that despised Carthage deep in their bones. So it's hard to say what would be different. If Rome fell and Hannibal took command of the Roman Republic, if the Italian city-states swore allegiance to Carthage, our alphabet would be based on the Phoenician alphabet, not the Roman alphabet. Europe would not have seen the civilizing effect of Rome. Places like Gaul, Britannia, and Germania might not have come in conflict with the Mediterranean civilization until centuries later. Roman civilization was a masculine one. Warfare was central to the state, to the survival of the state, and the masculine virtues reigned in Roman society. And we see the echoes of that in our society today. But Carthage was a much more feminine society. Now, they weren't a matriarchy. They still had kings, they still had armies, they still fought wars, but the role of women and the feminine virtues were much stronger in Carthage than in Rome, at least according to the chauvinistic Roman historians who wrote about the city. I wonder if Christianity would have the same place in the world today if Carthage had won. Would that tiny Jewish heresy of the Christ that occurred in the Eastern Mediterranean have become the world-spanning religion that it is today? Personally, I think it would at least be similar. The Christians turned out to be pretty perseverant in the face of Rome, but Christianity wouldn't have been filtered through a Roman and then later a Germanic lens. It would have been filtered through a Carthaginian lens, and I wonder what that would have looked like. Regardless, when Carthage did finally fall, the Berber people of North Africa continued on. They fished, they hunted, they herded, they continued having children, and continued their lives. But then the one-time Carthaginian city, Utica, was colonized by Rome. Now the Romans, as opposed to the Carthaginians, were an expansionist imperialistic civilization. They took over Berber tribes and kingdoms. They brought all of them under the Roman fold. They named the shores that they had just conquered after the local name that the Libyan Berbers gave to their tribe, the Afri. They called their shores, their new colonial holdings, Africa. The Romans went on to conquer the Numidian civilization, another Berber people. They went on to conquer the whole of North Africa, from the Atlantic to all the way eventually to Egypt. Then they conquered the ancient Phoenician lands in the Levant and the lands of the Israelites. They had Greece as well, and then they expanded into a former Carthaginian colonial holding and called it Roman Hispania. Shortly after those Romans conquered the Levant, the local Jewish population saw two major upheavals. First, there was the birth of a messianic cult that blossomed into a sect and finally into its own distinct religion. Then the Jews fought a revolt against Rome. They lost and saw their second temple destroyed, and much of the population dispersed. Now, we've recently discussed the Jews that were relocated to Hispania, but many, many more of those fled to Egypt and then on into Berber lands, most notably into Morocco. There is one island off the coast of Tunisia that may actually have a Jewish population that is significantly older, dating back to the destruction of the first temple. Genetic studies have shown a distinction between the Jews of that island, Djerba, and the Jews that fled after the destruction of the second temple. So there were communities of Jewish people in Berber lands. In fact, Berber Judaism is as ancient as the Berbers themselves. It would have been a place of safety and respite. Those Jews went on to establish other communities in Roman Africa, and those communities would go on to welcome Jewish exiles from Hispania and Rome in about 400 years. But the Romans were not a religiously oppressive people. Jews, Berber pagans, Christians, and Roman pagans all lived side by side under Roman hegemony. They built roads and aqueducts and hospitals and schools, and eventually they would go on to build monasteries. As Christianity rose to prominence within the Roman Empire, that North African monastic tradition grew into one of the most interesting in the world. The Berber people left behind their traditional religion and adopted Christianity pretty quickly, but they fell into a bizarre asceticism. There was a man named Saint Simeon who was an ascetic monk that was sought out for prayers and blessings. He became so bothered by the constant pilgrimages to see him that he hid himself away in a cave, but even that cave was found and his rest was disturbed. He no longer had the opportunity to commune with God, so he had a pillar constructed and built a small platform on top of it, and then he climbed up on top of that pillar to live for 37 years. Children would bring him milk and bread to eat, and people did come to pray at the foot of his pillar, but they never climbed up to bother him. There were Berber monks who fasted until death. Some of them lived on nothing but sunlight and water, only eating once or twice a month, and lived longer than anybody should rightfully be able to in those situations. These ascetics, in the eyes of Rome, were entertaining frivolities. The problem came, though, when the Berber people started to disavow marriage altogether. They believed that Christ was on his way, he would come back in their lifetime, and they wanted to be pure when he arrived. A generation of the Berber people almost failed. No one wanted to have children, and every woman desired to be a nun. Women left their husbands to go join the nunnery. And not just a few women. Lots and lots of women left their husbands without having children to join a nunnery. Girls gave up the idea of marriage altogether to go join the nunnery. Rome had a problem with that, namely that their colony was about to be depopulated. So they sent an army into Africa. But it wasn't an army of soldiers, it was an army of women. They built theaters and harems and brothels, and they filled them with the most beautiful women to be found in the entirety of the Roman Empire. There were red-haired Germans and yellow-haired Slavs and black-haired Celts. There were sub-Saharan Africans with dark skin and Greeks with olive complexion and beautiful blue-eyed Persian girls who knew dances that would quicken even the most pious of hearts. They had a system in place as well. The theaters would put on plays that had holy themes that would draw in the pious Berber men. But the actors, all of whom were the most beautiful women among that collection of most beautiful women, danced and flowed and played their parts with, quote, unencumbered charms, end quote. They were deeply heretical, of course. One might go to see a play of piety expecting to see the Virgin Mary or Mary Magdalene, but not expect to see her with unencumbered charms dancing the dances of the East. Those theaters were built next door to brothels. The men who had just been tricked into seeing such a lascivious play didn't have time to cool their blood. Sometimes they would even have doorways directly from the theater into the brothel so that no respecting citizen would have to see you go from one into the other. Now, those brothels and the harems were built next door to chapels with priests inside, and the women that had been imported into this Berber civilization were encouraged to convince the men that came to visit them into marriage. Failing that, though, they were at least to bear children. Now, this activity seems to have saved North Africa from a pious depopulation, but it had two effects. First, it may have played a role in why North Africa and the Berber people, and by extension Carthage, that entire region, have long been characterized as seductive and sensual people. Now, that reputation existed in earlier writings as well, probably because Carthage had a relatively free class of women, but this army of beauties probably added to that reputation. There are records of merchants and priests returning from North Africa in which they can talk about nothing but the belly dancing. Second, though, this army of women makes the genetic roots of the Berbers notoriously hard to pin down. There were Egyptian and Phoenician and Roman influences on the Berber people, but now there were women from Persia and Hispania and Gaul and Britannia and everywhere in the Roman Empire. In the end, the Roman Empire held North Africa and the Berber people under their political sway for 500 years, give or take a century here or there. They lived in a mutual peace and toleration for the most part. Once the Berber people had agreed to pay taxes, they were allowed the use of Roman roads and Roman aqueducts, but they were left similar to how Carthage had treated them, mostly alone, out in the wilderness, herding and fishing and trading. Abu Nasr writes in A History of the Maghreb, quote, "What made the Berbers accept the Roman way of life all the more readily was that the Romans, though a colonizing people who captured their lands by might of arms, did not display any racial exclusiveness and were remarkably tolerant of Berber religious cults, be they indigenous or grafted from the Carthaginians." However, the Roman territory in Africa was unevenly penetrated by Roman culture. Pockets of non-Romanized Berbers continued to exist throughout the Roman period, even in such areas as eastern Tunisia and Numidia. End quote. Religious and racial toleration made North Africa under Roman rule a peaceful and mostly happy place. However, the observant listener might have noticed that Abu Nasr isn't a particularly Roman name. The Roman Empire in the west began to decline. The Roman legions in North Africa pulled back to defend Rome. Now, at first, this actually seemed pretty great for the Berbers. They had all of those Roman advancements, the roads and the medicine and the aqueducts, but they were able to reorganize and come in from the fields to take over the urban life of North Africa, to start up their own kingdoms. They split up the coast along their own internal tribal lines. There was conflict between them, but soon enough all of those kingdoms were on their way to being fully established. And then Rome fell. One of the Germanic tribes that had been fighting the Roman legions, the Vandals, invaded Hispania alongside the Visigoths, and then moved on to conquer North Africa and the lands of all the Berbers in about 429. Now, they were Christian Germanic peoples, but not Roman Catholic. They were Arianist heretics. Arianism, well, first of all, its name shares an unfortunate similarity with the idea of an Aryan race, but that's based in 19th century ideas and takes its name from ancient Sanskrit. Arianism was actually born from an Alexandrian Berber, a bishop named Arius. Arius is an interesting character, and actually the Arian heresy is the central question of the Council of Nicaea. The distinction there is the nature of Jesus Christ. Catholics believed in the divine nature of Jesus, while Arianists believed that Jesus was a mortal, just the Son of God, and therefore a separate entity. The Berbers, even after a very long occupation by the Roman Empire, were those that were Christian, mostly Arian. The Berbers initially resisted the Vandal invasion, but once they realized that they had some common religious grounds, some of them actually allied against the urban, Romanized Catholic population of North Africa. And once the Visigothic invasion was complete, a large number of Sephardi Jews from Hispania migrated south into North Africa. The Visigoths were Catholic and brutal, while the Vandals and the Berbers were much more welcoming. The Sephardi Iberian Jews assimilated immediately into the many Jewish Berber communities that had been established way back in the 1st century. Those communities would go on to spread into other communities across North Africa, and they would welcome hundreds of thousands of Jewish exiles in about 1,000 years. Now, even after the fall of the city of Rome and the collapse of the Roman Empire in Europe, the Roman Empire still existed. Sometimes we call them the Byzantine Empire, after their capital city, Byzantium. But when Rome fell, their capital was no longer called Byzantium. It was called Constantinople, after Constantine the Great. And shortly after the Vandal invasion of North Africa, Constantinople had a new the Great in charge, Justinian the Great. He reclaimed much of the Roman Empire from Italy and Cisalpine Gaul all the way to southern Hispania and down into Africa. But that all ended with the death of Justinian. At the end of his reign as emperor, what many consider to be the last true emperor of the Roman Empire, a young man was born in Mecca named Muhammad ibn Abdullah. He preached in his lifetime a new prophetic message from God in the tradition of Abraham, of Moses, and Jesus. Politically and religiously, his primary aim was to convert all of the pagan people of Arabia into his faith. That was paramount to his teachings. As far as the Jews and Christians in Arabia were concerned, he considered them brothers in the Abrahamic faiths. He encouraged the spreading of the word of Islam, but he discouraged evangelizing. Christians and Jews were to be welcomed, honored guests. They were to be treated as though they were all family under the same God. This was a radical teaching of toleration, similar in many respects to the teachings of Jesus Christ at the dawn of the 1st century. But European Christianity turned away from many of those early Christian teachings in a search for power. The toleration that Jesus preached would not last, and the toleration that Muhammad preached wouldn't last either. Partly because the Byzantine Roman Empire, they didn't share those views of religious toleration, especially not when it was for a new religious leader and his descendants that were busy gaining influence and power on the border of their own empire. They saw dangerous things happening over there. I mean, sure, unite the people of Arabia, that's fine, but stay in your lane. And they didn't stay in their lane. After the death of Muhammad, one line of his descendants started a caliphate, and they started annexing lands. They captured much of Persia, modern-day Iraq, and then they moved on into Syria, which at the time belonged to the Eastern Roman Empire. In 638 CE, they took the city of Jerusalem. Now, that first caliphate moved on to take over other Byzantine holdings. They went into Egypt, and then they moved west into Berber territory. Now, that's a lot of land to digest in only a few short decades. Persia, Syria, Egypt, Arabia. It was, in a lot of ways, not unlike the early Mongol conquests or even the early Roman conquests. And much like the Mongols and the Romans, after those initial victories, powerful men within their empire realized they had differences on how things should be run and, more importantly, who should be running it. There were differing ideologies within that Muslim caliphate. Now, the primary ideological difference within Islam is a differing of opinion on who the prophet named as his rightful successor. There are some other religious practices, but that distinction laid the groundwork for the sectarian divide in Islam between Sunni and Shia Muslims. Those differences, those ideological differences, those differences of idea, turned into violence and then into a civil war. Now, the ramifications of that civil war have led to a sectarian divide that the world has still, to this day, not figured out how exactly to deal with. But for our purposes, we're going to look at those who came out on top in that initial conflict, the Sunni side of the ideological divide, and what they established, the Umayyad Caliphate. Now, the Umayyad Caliphate rose quickly to become one of the largest and most powerful empires of all time. They're up there with Rome and the Mongols. Now, the Umayyad Caliphate completed the conquest of North Africa. They had Egypt and everything else along the coast they gave an Arabic name. They called it the Maghreb. Now, the Maghreb is our focus today. It still incorporates today parts of modern-day Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, and Mauritania. However, the Umayyad conquest was a military conquest, much like the Vandal and Roman conquests, but in many ways more violent. The Umayyad had fewer allies than the Carthaginians or the Romans or the Vandals, and they faced more resistance. My favorite of those stories of rebellion is the story of Queen Dihya. Her story is among the many great tales of rebellions, of wars of defense or independence that were led by women. And there's something there. There's something I don't quite have a proper grasp of. The Greek god of liberty and freedom was a goddess, Libertas. Lady Liberty and the Statue of Liberty both carry the torch of liberty, a symbol rooted in Greece. The French painting commemorating the July Revolution is liberty leading the people, and liberty is personified by a woman with one of her breasts exposed so that you can't miss she's a woman, and she's carrying the tricolor in one hand and a musket in the other. Now, all of that is art. French painting, Greek sculptures, the Statue of Liberty, that's art, and it's all in a classical style, so it makes sense to return to a Grecian inspiration for that. But the Greeks were really onto something with their goddess, Libertas, because, well, the real world has so many examples of women leading revolutions. Now, there may be another layer of symbolism here. A woman heading a rebellion or a revolution is a symbol of what is at stake, of what the invading, conquering force is there to take and what the defenders are there to fight for. It may be a not too subtle message telling the freedom fighters, whomever they may be, that if we are to lose this, our wives and our daughters and our sisters will, against their will, become the wives of the invaders. For example, Joan of Arc was not a military leader. She was a potentially schizophrenic teenager that had prophetic visions. But the French Dauphin and the military commanders of the time utilized her charisma and her beauty to inspire the troops that were fighting a losing war. However, there are many, many real-world women who led the charge. There's Boudica's rebellion in Britannia, there's Grace O'Malley in Ireland, there's Queen Tomiri who killed Cyrus the Great. And then even into the 20th century, we see the Russian Revolution sparked off by a women's march protesting for bread. Some of the most famous and celebrated freedom fighters against the Nazi regime in France, well, they were young women, some of them no older than Joan of Arc. And Dihya, on the Berber coast, was an indigenous Jewish Berber queen. She led her people in the defense of the Berber coast. Now, most of what we know of her comes from either legend or from Arabian chroniclers. They claim she was a Jewish priestess, a sorceress, and a soothsayer. Now, I don't want to hammer home the similarities between Roman accounts of Queen Dido of Carthage and the Umayyad accounts of Dihya, but both women did straddle that line, according to their enemies, between a witch and a goddess. Now, I'm sure that has nothing to do with two distinctly masculine, patriarchal civilizations invading societies in which women can hold positions of power and influence and then destroying those civilizations so that they can write the history. But Queen Dihya was a princess of a tribe in modern-day Algeria. They had converted almost to a person to Judaism, probably from their indigenous religion. Her father was killed in battle with the Muslim invaders, and Dihya picked up the torch of liberty and led her people there to victory on the battlefield. That was a victory so sound that the entire Umayyad army fled back into Libya. Dihya reigned in peace over not only her tribe but the allied tribes for 5 years. Now, there is an argument and some evidence that some of her policies turned the urban Roman Christians against her, and that led them to aid the Umayyad Caliphate against the Berbers. But all of that needs to be taken lightly. There may be truth in it, but everything that we know of her was written by the victors, by the Umayyad Caliphate. For example, according to Muslim writers that were actually there, when the Umayyad armies eventually returned in strength, Queen Dihya went to battle. She fought bravely and valiantly, but when defeat was imminent, she was given a vision from Allah and underwent a battlefield conversion. And then she was killed, accidentally. Now that's a handy story when you want the people who believed in her, the people who followed her, to convert to your religion. Rather than see her as a martyr, that turns her into a torchbearer. Those Muslim writers also claimed that her sons converted on the battlefield and led the now combined Berber and Umayyad army to victory across the rest of North Africa, and even one of them up into Spain. Now that probably didn't happen. However, one way or another, within a few years, the Umayyad Caliphate controlled all of what had once been ancient Egypt, the Phoenician world, including Carthage, and the Roman African diocese, and most of Hispania. The Umayyad Caliphate ascended to power quickly. We're talking within a lifetime or two, but they ruled precipitously. Their first move in North Africa was a good one. The Christian and Jewish Berber people of the Maghreb were encouraged to convert but allowed to keep to their traditions, and they were even allowed to stand trial according to their own religious laws. Now that all seems pretty good. But the fatal mistake of the Umayyad Caliphate appears to have been a lack of religious and racial toleration within Islam. They relied too much on central rule from Damascus, and they demanded that every Muslim under their banner bend to their direct will. So another civil war took place within Islam. The Umayyad Caliphate was overthrown. Their primary successors were the Abbasid Caliphate. Now, they too were Sunni, but they were racially distinct from the Umayyad. They moved the capital to Baghdad, and initially they claimed all of the former Umayyad lands, including the Maghreb, but they were forced to cede several of them to former Umayyad emirs who turned into other smaller caliphates. First of all, there was the Emirate of Cordoba in Spain, which became the Caliphate of Cordoba, an autonomous nation. Then the Idrisid dynasty took power in Morocco. That founded essentially what is modern-day Morocco. They were raised into power by the Berber population there. They wanted nothing to do with the politics and problems in the Middle East. Then the Fatimid Caliphate took over the rest of northern Africa. They had the entirety of the Maghreb and Egypt. Now, there are more, but we're sitting at about 800 or 900 CE here and deep into medieval Muslim history, and most of that isn't particularly relevant. There were internal troubles, dynastic struggles, and a lot of crusades involved. Europe was almost constantly at war with the Turk, but I want to fast forward about 500 years. The caliphates in the Berber lands of the Maghreb stayed more or less stable throughout that time. But by 1400 or so, the newest Islamic empire, the Ottoman Empire, had taken command of the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates. Everything except for Morocco, which was much larger than modern-day Morocco, a sliver of the Fatimid dynasty, and Muslim Spain were now under Ottoman rule. The Ottomans pushed the Byzantine Empire back until, in 1453, Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks. The emperor that took over the city, named Mehmed the Conqueror, was caliph of his Ottoman Empire, but he also took up the title of Caesar, of the Romans. He called himself Emperor of all the Romans. Through this claim, which he and his descendants took very seriously, there is an argument to be made that if the emperor were the Roman Empire lasted until 1922. Now, most reputable historians would discount that entirely. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire was no more an emperor of Rome than the Holy Roman Emperor was an emperor of Rome. However, there were at least 3 men that claimed the title of Caesar during World War I, the Kaiser, the Tsar, and the Sultan. But most would agree that the Roman imperial tradition fell in 1453 with Constantinople. Now, Mehmed the Conqueror claimed that by right of conquest of Constantinople he was now Caesar, and he had a right to all that the Byzantine Empire had ever held, including everything under Emperor Justinian. That means Greece, Eastern Europe, Italy, Cisalpine Gaul, Sicily, Cordoba, Egypt, and the Maghreb, plus Persia, Arabia, Syria, and all that came with being caliph. Basically, he was caliph and Caesar all in one, and there was little doubt in Europe that he intended to stop there. If he were Caesar of the Roman Empire, shouldn't he possess France, Spain, and Britain as well? Now, there is a distinction to be made here. It's an inaccurate distinction filled with Western bias, and it doesn't even get close to including all of the details that should be included, but it will help us to better understand the situation. In European minds, the Muslim world was divided between 2 political and racial bodies. There was the Turk, which could refer to any Muslim person or nation, but more specifically it meant those in the Ottoman Empire or the former Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates. And then there were the Moors. Now, the Moors, didn't exist. Not really. There were no Moorish people. There was no Moorish state. There was Morocco, but when a European would say a Moor, they meant any Muslim Berber inhabitant of Spain or North Africa. This could also often include the Jewish inhabitants of Spain and North Africa. Now, there are, of course, dozens, perhaps hundreds of sectarian, racial, and cultural distinctions within the Islamic world, but in the minds of the Europeans, this was the big one. About 50 years after the fall of Constantinople, the Moors were finally, conclusively pushed out of Spain. That was 1492. They continued on in Morocco as leaders, but the rest of the Maghreb Berbers were falling under the sway of the Ottoman Empire and their Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent. Next time, we're going to focus on that period. the fall of the last vestiges of Islamic Spain, the spread of Muslims and Jews into the Mediterranean, and the power struggles between Suleiman the Magnificent and Charles V. We're going to focus in on that through the eyes of two brothers who were arguably the first Barbary pirates. My focus here on the show has always been Caribbean piracy, the West Indies, the New World, and that hasn't really changed. But I have come to realize that it's a mistake to ignore certain aspects of piracy outside of the New World. I was attempting to draw a line of influences down from Francis Drake to the greater pirates in the Golden Age, but I realized that I was missing a major part of the story. One of the greatest influences on the Golden Age of piracy didn't happen anywhere near the New World. There were pirates who, to the minds of many Europeans, especially the Spanish, well, those pirates were a greater threat than anyone in the Golden Age of piracy. They were a combined force of religiously and politically dispossessed people. That's been a common theme throughout the show, and it's one that we'll see many more times, but typically it's been Protestant sects that have been religiously dispossessed. But in this case, there were some Protestants later on in this story, but mostly they were Jewish and Muslim corsairs. And they, even more so than Henry Morgan or Blackbeard, intended to bring down the Spanish Empire. This is episode 75, Oruç and Khizr. I promised myself that I wouldn't get into the Crusades when I began researching today's episode, but I am immediately going to break that promise. However, I'll do so as fast as possible. Well before the Prophet Muhammad was even born, before Islam existed in 603 CE, the Pope commissioned a hospital to be built in the city of Jerusalem. It wasn't just a hospital, it was a hostel as well. It was a place that would give any Christians on a pilgrimage to the Holy City food and shelter and protection. Well after it was originally commissioned, Charlemagne built onto it and gave it an impressive library, a library that was added to by subsequent popes and rulers throughout the centuries. It was called the Hospital of St. John, since it was built on the site of an old monastery that was devoted to John the Baptist. Now, the hospital was destroyed initially in the 11th century by Muslim invaders and was rebuilt after the First Crusade when Christian crusaders took the city back. It continued to serve its purpose of giving aid and food and shelter, but instead of passing pilgrims, it was giving aid and shelter to crusaders. It became a sort of a rallying point for Christian soldiers in Jerusalem. There were knights without a feudal lord back in Europe, there were men-at-arms, and then there were armed chaplains, and they all gathered there at the hospital. In 1130 CE, the Pope made them an official chivalric order of knights. They called themselves the Knights of the Hospital of St. John, or the Knights Hospitalier. They weren't the first holy order of knights, but they were probably the oldest in Jerusalem. Now, they and other holy orders like the Knights Templar and the Teutonic Knights, well, they stayed in Jerusalem. Whenever a crusade ended, most knights that were pledged to a lord back in Europe would return to Europe, but not these holy orders. They were all pledged to defend Jerusalem against Islam, but they weren't united. They bickered and fought among themselves for position until, in 1291, Jerusalem finally fell to the Umayyad dynasty. The Knights Templar and the Teutonic Knights and most of the other holy orders returned to Europe and were eventually disbanded. But the Knights Hospitalier instead retreated to an island called Cyprus off the coast of Turkey, and then, once that was lost, onto an island called Rhodes. That's an island in the far eastern extent of modern-day Greece. Now, the Knights Hospitalier operated as the Knights of Rhodes for years. They used Rhodes as a base when they sent their soldiers in to defend Turkey and Constantinople from the Ottoman Empire. However, eventually they lost that fight in 1453. The Ottomans, though, continued their march west into Greece. The Knights of Rhodes fought them every step of the way, but it was a slow and losing fight. One of those losses, among many, many other losses, occurred on the Greek island of Lesbos in 1462, and it's here that our story begins. One of the military leaders of the conquest of Lesbos was an Albanian Ottoman commander named Jakub. In recognition of his achievements as a commander, he was made Aja, sort of a governor or maybe a mayor, over the village called Bonova. There on Lesbos, he took as his wife the widow of a slain Greek Orthodox priest. Her name was Katerina. She was Greek and Greek Orthodox, as her husband had been, but Jakub was Albanian and a Muslim. And soon enough, Katerina was a Muslim as well. Jakub retired from his military career after the conquest of the island, and he opened up a pottery workshop there on the island. It was a successful enterprise, and before long he made enough to buy a ship with which he traded all over the Greek islands. Jakub and Katerina had 6 children, 4 sons and 2 daughters. Now, we don't know much about their daughters. We don't even know their names. But we do know a bit about all of the sons. The eldest was named Ishak. The second son, Oruç or Oruç, was born in 1474. He's one of the names you'll need to remember. The third son, Khizr, was born in 1478. Now, a quick pronunciation note on his name. To pronounce it properly requires the use of a sound that well, you know how some people have trouble rolling their R's without sounding a bit foolish? That's me with this sound. It's that sound that's so common in Arabic and Hebrew that originates in the back of the throat, but rather than butcher that or sound like a bad parody, I'm just going to call him Khizr. He was followed by the 4th and final son, Ilyas. Now, Khizr and Oruç both had a characteristic that they shared with Katerina, their mother. They were born with fiery red hair. All 6 children would help with the family business, pottery, but as the boys grew older, they left the potter's workshop behind and joined their father on his trading voyages around the Aegean and the Greek islands. Now, one had to be a bit brave to trade in the Aegean Sea in those days. It was still a place of conflict. The Ottoman Sultan in 1480 besieged the Knights of Rhodes. See, Greece now belonged to the Ottoman Empire, and he wanted those Catholic knights out of Greece entirely. The Knights of Rhodes withstood the siege and even went so far as to establish a fortress on Halicarnassus in Anatolia, what we would call Turkey today. That fortress is called Bodrum Castle, and it's an impressive seaside keep. The Knights of Rhodes and the Ottoman Empire, well, they were engaged in a duel. They had been for centuries at this point, but now most of their fighting was taking place on the sea, at least since the entirety of Anatolia belonged to the Ottoman Empire. The knights built castles and guarded them, but most of the seaborne fighting was done through the employment of privateers. There were Greek privateers, sort of freedom fighters. There were Italian naval mercenaries, and then there were men from the Baltic and North Seas that wanted a piece of some of that papacy-endorsed piracy, some of that Ottoman plunder. There were Frenchmen and Englishmen and Dutchmen and Norsemen. All of them wanted to get in on the fight. Now, this fighting, this privateering, was a problem in the Mediterranean, but for the time being, it was no more than a mercantile problem. The Ottoman rulers, the sultans and emirs, considered the deaths and profit losses small enough to be acceptable. But every time that a new ship was taken by one of these European privateers, well, the situation grew more and more volatile. Eventually, those emirs and imams and kings and sultans, well, they would be forced to get involved. But meanwhile, on the other end of the Mediterranean, far from the Levant, far from Greece to the west, the big events of the time were taking place. Philip Gosse writes in his 1932 book, The History of Piracy, quote, "In 1492, that year of years in modern history, Spain under Ferdinand and Isabella wrested control of Iberia from the Moors and sent them scurrying back across the Straits of Gibraltar. It was revenge for their wrongs, at least as much for the desire to compensate themselves for their lost property, that incited the Moors into an unrelenting hostility against Spain, which ultimately became part of a holy war. When Venetian and Genoese enterprises began to revive the ancient glories of Eastern commerce, the familiar temptation was renewed, and dusky men in turbans and long robes flitted in oared boats from coast to island in the path of the gorgeous, high-decked galleys of the princely Italian cities." End quote. There is a lot of casual 1932-era prejudice and racism and Western bias in Philip Gosse's work, but he does have quite a way with words. He makes a lot of assumptions and factual mistakes, probably for dramatic effect. For example, he states that 1492 was the year all of the Moors were kicked out of Spain, and that's not true. The last Moorish stronghold in Spain was defeated in 1492, but it wasn't the Muslims that were kicked out of Spain en masse in 1492. It was the Jews. The Ottoman Sultan, Bayezid II, sent out a fleet of his best ships to collect the Sephardi Jewish exiles and bring them into his empire and welcome them. He imposed strict rules and harsh punishments on anyone that harmed a Jew for any reason other than self-defense within the Ottoman Empire. He was more than happy to welcome this large population, hundreds of thousands of educated, skilled Europeans. He was once quoted saying, "You venture to call Ferdinand a wise ruler, he who has impoverished his own country and enriched mine." End quote. And he was wise in that sentiment. The Sephardi Jews had knowledge that his empire didn't. For example, it was a Jew that built the first printing press in the Ottoman Empire in Constantinople in 1493. There were skilled merchants, physicians, and mathematicians among the exiles. And then there were the shipwrights, the navigators, and the map-makers. See, the Ottoman galley had at one time been the best ship in the world west of China. They learned from the Vikings and shared knowledge with them. They built a fleet with that knowledge that mastered the Mediterranean. But by 1492, those galleys were old and outdated. The Iberian shipbuilders had taken much of the knowledge that the Ottoman Empire had created and far surpassed it. Christopher Columbus was crossing the Atlantic Ocean at that moment due to the Italian and Spanish modifications that were based on the Islamic design. But the Ottoman ships themselves were falling behind. They had to skim near shore on voyages of any real length. But all of that was starting to change now that those Jewish refugees brought in all that new knowledge with them. One of those families of Sephardi exiles that fled Iberia with Ottoman aid eventually settled in the Ottoman Greek city Smyrna on the coast of Turkey. And I should mention, when there is a question between Arabic and Greek names here, I'm going to revert to the name that's used today, the name that we would best understand a place by. For example, Smyrna and Lesbos had Arabic names at the time. They weren't called Smyrna or Lesbos. And Turkey had a Greek name, Anatolia, at the time, but most of the time we will understand them best if I use their modern names. Now that family that settled on Smyrna had a young son who had been born in Iberia. He was younger than Yaqub's 4 sons, named Sinan. He was, at this point, still a bit young to be one of those dusky young men flitting out to raid Spanish shipping, but he must have admired those pirates. Now, some of those young men that he may have admired were the 4 sons of Yaqub, the 4 brothers. They had spent several years sailing with their father, But then that crisis in Spain called for sailors from all over the Ottoman Empire, including Greece, including their island at Lesbos, and the brothers went out to help the exiles reach Ottoman shores. The second eldest brother, Oruç, procured a ship. Now, exactly how he did so, the tale differs depending on who you choose to believe. The European historians of the era will have you believe that he captured a vessel filled with good Catholics, killed everyone on board, cursed Jesus, and had tea with Lucifer himself on the deck. The Ottomans will tell you, and, well, they were the ones that were there, that he was merely using his father's ship, the ship of a war hero, you might remember, the ship of an Aja, a governor, a respected man, and the ship of a father of 6 wonderful children, an innocent ship with no cause to face any trouble on the sea. But in reality, probably neither of those things are true. He probably just bought a ship, probably even a few years earlier. See, Oruç was himself a successful trader and probably bought his own ship to add to his father's merchant fleet. But in 1492, when that Iberian crisis occurred, he and the youngest brother, Ilyas, took that ship to the western Mediterranean. They started smuggling Muslims and Jews from Iberia to safe harbors all around the Ottoman Empire. At this point, Oruç would have been about 20 years old, and Ilyas would have been about 14. It was possibly here on these voyages that Oruç earned his first nickname, Baba Oruç, or Papa, or Father Oruç. Now, some writers will tell you that this is where he earned his other, more famous nickname, based on Baba Oruç, but you should not listen to those historians. There might be a linguistic connection somewhere, but this isn't the origin of his latter name. On one of those voyages to the Iberian Peninsula, Oruç and his ship were traveling to Spain when a privateer happened upon them, a privateer from the Knights Hospitalier. Oruç and his crew realized they were under attack, and they put up a fight, but his ship was a smuggling vessel, not a privateer vessel. She was built for speed and maybe for stealth, but not really for battle, at least not with the Knights of Rhodes. In that fighting, Ilyas, aged 14, the youngest brother, was killed. And then Oruç, the son of a war hero and a hero himself to many Jewish and Muslim exiles, was captured along with his crew and his vessel. The Crusader Knights imprisoned Oruç and held him in the dungeon of Bodrum Castle on Halicarnassus. Exactly why he was imprisoned is hard to say, and trying to get to the root of the issue is difficult, and it's mired in ideology. Was he the vile pirate that the Knights of Rhodes would claim? Well, we don't have any records of any piracies committed by him before he was imprisoned here, but that doesn't mean that didn't happen. Was he merely the kind-hearted sailor giving aid to Muslim and Jewish exiles? He did that, but that wasn't enough to imprison a man for. In reality, he was probably a bit of both. See, the Ottoman Sultan had authorized his emirs, his governors, to grant licenses for privateering, and Oruç probably had one of those. If you were going to travel all the way across the Mediterranean to transport refugees from point A to point B, well, it would only make sense along the way to take a few prizes and fill your war chest. But the real reason that Oruç was captured was because the Knights of Rhodes were at war with the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman privateers that were new to the game were at war with the Knights of Rhodes, with all of the Crusaders. Now, most of the crew of Oruç's vessel had been hauled off to serve as galley slaves on Christian privateer ships, but no one was willing to let Oruç near a ship. See, he was a compelling commander. He was a man that, given the opportunity, and a galley slave would have this opportunity, well, he was likely to convince the men to mutiny. He was best left in a cell all alone on dry land. But throughout all of this, his family wasn't idle. Their mother and father, Katerina and Jakub, and presumably the sisters, if they hadn't been married off, well, they ran the pottery workshop. The eldest brother, Ishak, looked after the merchant fleet. He looked after trade and sort of took that element of the family business over. Presumably, the entire family mourned the loss of their youngest son, Ilyas, and they had at some point learned that Oruç had been captured, but they didn't know where he was taken or whether he was slated to be executed. They might not even have been certain that he was still alive. However, the two brothers that weren't running the fleet or in chains, well, they planned. Through his merchant connections with islands all throughout the Aegean and western Mediterranean seas, Ishak was able to procure a ship and a privateering commission. However, neither of those things were intended for him. The third brother, the youngest brother left alive, Khizr, well, he was following in Oruç's footsteps. He was a seafarer, and like his brother, he learned to speak and write in Arabic, Greek, Italian, French, and Spanish. Possibly, even probably, they knew Armenian as well, although we aren't certain of that. While Oruç was still imprisoned, Khizr started privateering. Khizr gathered a small crew and roved the Aegean, looking for Italian merchant ships to capture. As time went on, it became clear that he was a skilled privateer. He was a tactician. He wasn't much of a sailor. He didn't know really much of anything about currents or navigation, but, well, those weren't the suits that were needed to be a successful privateer captain. He needed intelligence, brutality, and the ability to outthink his enemies. But perhaps the most important to his success was the vast network of spies that he had all across the Mediterranean. See, his father, Yakub, was well known. He was a military commander and a governor, and he had allies all across the empire. He also had that family business that granted them trading partners that, well, they learned things. They picked up tidbits of information, and well, they were willing to divulge some of that information, anywhere from Egypt to Greece to the eastern coast of Italy. All of those merchants knew about the movements of rich and poorly guarded Italian ships that might set sail in the path of these privateers. Khizr used that knowledge to ambush or chase down or capture rich, fat Italian galleys. Now, his older brother, Baba Oruç, well, he had gained a reputation. He had a huge amount of love and admiration among the Muslim and Sephardi exiles. Many of them owed their lives and the lives of their children to Baba Oruç, and they wanted to join with his brother, with Khizr, to smite the Catholics and, if possible, to rescue Oruç. Now, the Jews among them knew the arts of navigation. They knew map-making. They knew sailing. See, most of the Mediterranean galleys were not sailing vessels. They had sails usually, but they relied on oars and galley slaves. But the Jews, at least the coastal seafaring Jews, well, they knew the arts of sail and rigging and tackle, the same arts that were currently conquering the New World. They incorporated those new talents into bigger and better vessels for these Ottoman privateers. They captured large Italian ships. They refit them for even better sailing. And then they armed them to the teeth. A Mediterranean galley circa 1500 would have been an entirely different beast than what we think of as a typical pirate ship. First of all, there was a very real possibility that some of them were sailing with old-style Greek dromons. Those were the heart of the medieval Byzantine navy, and they still would have existed in 1500. They were rigged with lateen sails, the triangular sails, and that design dated all the way back to Rome and Carthage. Now, typically they had 2 decks of oars, which they relied upon for propulsion. The dromon was the ship that was used to deliver Greek fire. Greek fire, at one point, was perhaps the greatest weapon on the sea, at least until the cannon came into naval use. It saved Constantinople many times over. Any time that an Arab invasion attempted to reach them from the sea, the Greek fire came to greet them. Greek fire was, well, it was a chemical solution. No one today knows exactly what that solution was. Some chemists believe that they have discovered what it may have been, but there are no records to prove whether or not they have. Greek fire was a sticky, viscous substance that floated on water and burned. It burned really, really hot. The dromon was armed with cranes and catapults, and even sometimes a tube at the ship's prow. Sometimes that tube came in the shape of a dragon that connected to pressurized pumps on the decks below, and that literally spit liquid fire at enemy ships. That fire burned and burned. No amount of water you poured on it would put it out, and it floated on water. It stuck to skin, and it wouldn't extinguish for hours. It burned slow. If you want to picture a battle at sea fought using Greek fire, well, there are paintings that depict what it may have looked like, but, well, in Game of Thrones, first of all, Valyrian steel is based on the semi-legendary Damascus steel that the Byzantines utilized, and then wildfire, that green superfire used in the Battle of the Blackwater Bay, well, that is based on Greek fire. It wouldn't have been green, but you get the idea. However, by about 1440 or so, the Byzantine Empire lost the ability to manufacture Greek fire. It's possible that the Ottoman forces that were encroaching on their territory took over whatever resources were used to make Greek fire and denied it to Constantinople. That might be why the city was lost in 1453. So if Khizr and his privateers did sail on a dromon at any point, it would have been pretty useless. They would have had a cool-looking dragon figurehead, but no Greek fire to spit out of it. Most of them sailed in a galio that's similar to a half-galley, smaller than a traditional Mediterranean galley, and originally lateen-rigged, those triangular sails, but those Jewish sailors would have modified them to be square-rigged in a Spanish style. That incorporated all three propellants. There was a square rig for full speed under good winds. There was a lateen rig at the fore to capture any errant breezes and aid in tacking about quickly, and then there would have been a deck of oars. Now, those oars served two purposes. First of all, they allowed you to move when there was no wind, but second, they added that last burst of speed needed when engaging another ship in battle. That system, using all three propellants, allowed Khizr to develop a style that would become famous, that he would make famous. He was able to outrun most of the ships on the Mediterranean. He could arrive ahead of time, before his targets, and he could close in for the kill before the slow-rolling Italian galleys knew what was happening. The prow of the galleot had a ram instead of a dragon, and when they sailed in or rowed in at top speed, that ram collided with an enemy ship. Behind that ram, they had a gangplank that would be lowered to allow deadly corsairs to swarm over an enemy vessel. And the boarding parties that these corsairs utilized, well, we'll talk more about them later. But they were backed up by archers and spearmen and scorpions and people throwing javelins. This system was not the most advanced in the world. The galleons that the Spanish and Portuguese were developing, and even some of the ships made in England and the Netherlands, well, they were bigger. They had guns on board more often than not, and they didn't rely on oarsmen, so that allowed them to fit more soldiers and more guns on board. But these ships used by these corsairs were among the best in the Mediterranean at the time, at least for their purposes. With his network, his vast network of contacts and spies, and the knowledge of the Iberian allies that he utilized, Khizr made a name for himself as one of the most successful corsairs in the Mediterranean. His crews gathered men wherever they went. They started off just in the Aegean, but they moved on to Turkish ports in the Levant. They moved on to Egypt. They moved on all along the Barbary coast. Everywhere that sailors and Iberian exiles might gather, well, men flocked to the banner of Khizr. He built a small armada of galleots, maybe 6 or 8 of them, with perhaps as many as 100 corsairs on board each of those ships. Then, after he had gathered sufficient strength, 3 years after his brother Oruç had been captured, one of those many contacts that Khizr utilized brought him word of his brother. They told him where Oruç was being held. Now, the story differs here, depending on who you choose to believe. In the first iteration, Khizr sailed his entire armada on Bodrum Castle on Halicarnassus. His fleet led a 3-pronged attack. The ships attacked the navy of the Knights Hospitalier. They rained down flaming arrows and scorpion bolts. They boarded vessels at anchor, and they slaughtered entire crews. Then a small army landed on the beach outside the castle and assaulted the walls head-on. This drew out the defenders and kept their attention. The third party was led by Khizr directly. Only maybe a dozen men, but the best to be had. They snuck in and scaled the castle wall from the rear. They crept in quietly and killed the dungeon guards silently. And then they broke Baba Oruç free. They made their way outside the castle walls with equal stealth, and then the army pulled their way back from the castle walls, and the navy fought themselves free from the bay. That's an exciting version of the story. It's a popular rendition, but it probably didn't happen that way. Instead, more than likely, once he learned where his brother was being held, Khizr probably just paid a ransom for him, and then they all walked away. That's how things worked in those days. At first, the brothers returned to their home on Lesbos to visit their family. They might have assumed for years that Oruç was dead, but while they were there, Oruç and Khizr talked about the future. See, Oruç had been a trader. Initially, he had been a smuggler for a time and a transporter of refugees. He may have been an occasional privateer, but Khizr had made a profession of privateering. He'd built a small fleet, and really, he was a full-time pirate. So the brothers sailed for the largest Mediterranean port in Ottoman Turkey, Anatolia, where the local governor, a man named Sezada Korkut, gave to them 18 galleots to continue and expand their operations. These were better ships than the brothers had ever sailed before, and Korkut even gave them enough slaves to man all of the oars. This man, Sezada Korkut, became their patron after a fashion. His name graced their commissions, and the ships he granted them allowed them to expand all across the Mediterranean. Now, the brothers focused, probably on Korkut's orders, mostly on attacking the Knights Hospitalier, the privateers they had all around the eastern Mediterranean. These 18 privateer vessels were sort of a counter to the Catholics. We should mention slaves here. It needs to be discussed. See, unlike the West Indian pirates later on, these Mediterranean pirates, be they Catholic or Muslim, they were never in the habit of letting their captives go. The later pirates would kill, they would capture vessels, and sometimes they would hold their prisoners for ransom, but once that was paid, they would let them go free. If no ransom was ever paid, the pirates might just drop them off on shore, or sometimes they would give them the worse of the 2 vessels and enough food to make it home. But that's not how the Mediterranean pirates operated. They killed and captured as well. But if no ransom were paid, they kept the prisoners. Sometimes, if there were no reason to ask for a ransom, if there was nobody valuable, they just kept them from the start. The men were chained up as galley slaves at the oars and worked to death. They were usually underfed, unpaid, and just rowed until exhaustion saw them thrown overboard. They were a renewable resource. There were always more slaves to take, and sometimes it made economic sense not to feed them. The very young children were sent to be raised in Islamic orphanages elsewhere in the Ottoman Empire. The women and girls were assaulted. Sexual violence against the infidel, at least, was accepted and even commonplace. When the pirates had no more use for them, they would sell those women off to the harems on the coast. And don't let images of women lounging around eating grapes in the Sultan's harem influence your image of what this was. This was human trafficking and sexual slavery. The only consolation, for now at least, is that there were few women on board any of the vessels captured by the sons of Yaqub. In 1502, the patron of Oruç and Khizr was granted a new governorship, but it was one that Korkut saw as a demotion rather than a promotion. I should point out, though, that Korkut was not just some governor. He wasn't just some emir. Korkut was the son of the Sultan. He was one of the sons of the Sultan, but he was a prince of the Ottoman Empire. For these privateers, he was a powerful friend, but by 1502, his influence in Istanbul was waning. When he got his demotion, he actually granted several more ships to the two brothers and expanded their fleet. However, in return for these new ships, he required them to undertake a few government contracts. See, there was a war happening in Europe due to a bunch of European politics between France and Spain and the Kingdom of Naples and Italy and the Papal States. Well, they were all fighting for control of cities and regions in modern-day Italy, and this Ottoman prince, Korkut, decided to throw his hat in the ring. He decided to try for a city on the coast called Apulia. Now, imagine you were a big cat, maybe a mountain lion, and you saw a huge pack of wolves fighting one another over a recent kill. What would you do in that situation? A cautious mountain lion would move on. See, nothing would stop those wolves fighting each other faster than someone else showing up to steal the kill. That would instead unify them. Big cats are survivors and know when to pick their battles. Sezada Korkut, prince of the Ottoman Empire, was not a cautious lion. His armada, now led by Oruç and Khizr, arrived off the coast to besiege and even to attempt a landing on the city, Apulia. However, when the several Catholic navies in the region that were all busy fighting one another, when they got wind of the Ottoman fleet in their waters, well, they stopped fighting and fell on Oruç and Khizr. This entire attempted invasion was, well, it was a bust. The Ottoman fleet just disbanded and went home. Korkut, after this failed invasion, fell into further disfavor with the Sultan, with his father. His attempt on Italy had cost men and money and ships, and it had gained the empire nothing. Korkut feared at this point that his father was planning to have him killed, so he just pulled back from international politics and set about administering his region. For now, at least, that was his plan. Oruç and Khizr, his privateers, well, they were left to their own devices, but they were left with their fleet. The two brothers had the opportunity to do as they wished, and they decided to sail west for the Berber coast of North Africa. They set up a base of operations on an island called Djerba in modern-day Tunisia. Now, Djerba has a storied past. According to legend, Odysseus stopped there on his voyage home from Troy. Jewish legend actually states that refugees fleeing the destruction of the first temple settled on Djerba in 586 BCE. There might actually be some truth in that. At least, well before Rome fell, Djerba had a stronghold and was home to many, many Jews. Now, we're talking about back when Carthage stood and back when Hannibal crossed the Alps. There were probably Jews living on the island. It was an excellent place for a base. It was an island, and thus it was difficult to reach except by a boat. It had a beautiful bay that was surrounded by natural defenses that made it among the most prized possessions on the Barbary coast. And then there were centuries of castle building to further defend Djerba. It's, for the Jews that fled their homes at least, a place not unlike Jamaica. It was a safe, defensible haven, far away from their enemies, on which the Jewish population could defend themselves from a hostile world. However, since Rome fell, things on Djerba had changed. The kingdom of Sicily claimed the island for a time, and then the Umayyad Caliphate took it over, and then Sicily took it over again. But by 1503, when Oruç and his brother arrived there, Sicily was in the hands of the Ottoman Empire, so Djerba once again belonged to a Muslim caliphate, but not the Ottoman Empire. A quick breakdown of the makeup of North Africa looked something like this. On the Atlantic coast, directly across the Strait of Gibraltar from Spain, was Morocco, ruled by an independent caliph. This included most of what is modern-day Algeria as well. To the east of Morocco, a smaller and nominally independent emirate called Algeria existed, and to the east of that was Tunisia, and that was controlled by an entirely separate caliphate called the Hafsid dynasty. The rest of the Maghreb, including Libya, was Ottoman territory. Now, Egypt was actually ruled by an independent Mamluk dynasty, but for now they're not important to the story. However, the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella saw an opportunity here. The Maghreb, the entirety of the North African coast, was fractured. They had no central leadership. Morocco and Tunisia were independent from each other and from the Turks, so the Catholic monarchs thought to gain a stronghold in North Africa. They wanted to, their propaganda was that they were going to continue the Reconquista, but they were actually just expanding imperially past Spain's borders. Now, this was a problem for the Tunisian Hafsid Sultan. See, to the east, he had Ottoman forces pushing at his eastern border. They wanted to incorporate his dynasty into the Ottoman Empire. And then to the north, he had Spanish forces coming in and capturing cities, making landfall and landing armies. So he decided it was in his best interest to cut a deal. There were two brothers with a large naval force that needed a base of operations in the western Mediterranean. The Sultan, the Hafsid Sultan, allowed them to use Djerba as a base, so long as they gave him 1/3 of all of their profits. The brothers agreed. They agreed that they would cleanse his waters of a Spanish presence as long as the Hafsid Sultan furnished them with men and ships and a base. Once this deal was cut, the brothers set about planning how best to fill their coffers and how best to rescue Tunisia. They settled on an ambitious plan to capture galley slaves and ships and a huge amount of money. In 1504, the Pope sent 2 large, well-armed galleys off from Genoa to collect his tributes from the Italian cities north of the Alps. They loaded up chests full of silver and gold and prepared for the short voyage back to mainland Genoa. They were passing by the small island of Elba when the lead ship of the 2, leagues ahead of the second and well out of sight of the other, spotted a small galliot off the coast of the island. Remember the square-rigged European-style sails the Sephardi refugees introduced to the corsairs? Well, those sails gave the captain of the first galley a false sense of security. More to the point, the sea west of Italy had been free from piracy for centuries. The Italian, French, and Spanish navies all patrolled those waters. Any sensible pirate would have to be mad to sail there, so that captain sailed on without worry. That galliot started toward the Italian galley on a course for interception, and the galley actually slowed down at first to see if she needed aid. Philip Ghost describes what the captain saw thus, quote, "The Italian saw that her deck was a mass of moving turbines. Without hail, even before the galley had time to stand to, a shower of arrows and shot was poured onto her crowded decks. A moment later the Moors were swarming over her sides, led by a thick-set figure with a fiery beard." End quote. The reality was a bit less dramatic than that. The galley actually did stop to help the galliot, only to see 2 more small galliots come in fast to surround his ship. His men realized their mistake. They fired on the galiots, but they couldn't hold off the incoming arrows, and they surrendered. See, that's why we actually know something about this attack. It was high profile, but the prisoners here were important enough to ransom off, so they actually lived to tell their story. Those stories are why we know about the Corsair captain and his brother and their fiery red beards. It can be easy to forget that these brothers were Ottoman but not Arabic. They were Armenian Greeks, and they had their mother's red hair and thick, long red beards. See, the Italians described their red beards in detail and named the two pirate captains Redbeard, in Italian, Barbarossa. These stories, the first real stories to reach the European mainland, gave the brothers their names, Oruç and Khizr Barbarossa. It was probably Oruç, the elder, who was in command here, but the following move was probably Khizr, and it seems that there was some argument about it. Khizr wanted to capture the second ship, but Oruç thought that it would be better to take this first wonderful Italian galley and all of the riches on board and sail away. Now, there may have been some brotherly competition in this. If they took that plan, Oruç would get a big Italian galley, and that would see him raised above Khizr, his brother, irreparably. In the eyes of all of the men in their crews, Khizr would be a subordinate, not a partner. So Khizr probably wanted to capture that second Italian galley to have a galley of his own. But he had a plan, and it was the sort of plan that pirates in the future, they would have admired it. Khizr suggested that they strip the prisoners, put them on the galleots, and then row those galleots off to hide. Meanwhile, the corsairs would remove their turbans and put on the Italian uniforms. They would fly the Genoan flag high and hail that second galley in. Then, when the galley thought that perhaps her partner needed aid, the pirates would open fire, and then the galleots would row in suddenly to surround her. This plan, developed by Khizr Barbarossa, by Redbeard, was the sort of plan that would have made Blackbeard proud 200 years later. Oruç consented, he agreed, and the pirates put the plan into motion. When the day was finally done, the corsairs sailed away with two brand-new Italian galleys. They were filled with good Italian guns and tens of thousands of florins in goods and coin. The oars were manned by Christian slaves, and, well, the Pope, they assumed, and they were correct, would pay to have the dignitaries returned. When the Barbarossa brothers returned in their fancy new Italian galleys, the people of Djerba hailed the pirates, and really, the Barbarossa brothers, well, they really weren't pirates. The Pope certainly thought they were pirates. Spain and Italy and France saw them as pirates when they learned of what had happened, but the Sultan of Tunisia didn't. The Ottoman prince, who was their patron, didn't see them as pirates, and the Ottoman Sultan didn't see them as pirates. But this sort of action, this breed of privateering, well, it would influence the English and Dutch privateers that paved the way for all of the New World pirates that would come later on. The fame that this single capture brought to the Barbarossas also brought them followers. Their ships swelled with warriors willing to fight and die for them. Some historians have called the warriors that signed up to sail with the Barbarossas Mujahideen, Islamic guerrilla forces that were fighting against outsiders in their lands. Now, this wasn't yet really accurate. They were still privateers and corsairs. This action also brought the brothers allies. The Ottoman sea commander, Kurtullu, sailed for Djerba. He wanted to join the forces of the brothers Barbarossa. His armada was among the strongest in the Mediterranean. The Jewish population of Djerba, the Sephardi Jews in Ottoman lands, well, they flocked to the banner of Baba Oruç. Now that he was free and operating out of a port friendly to the Jewish people, Jews from all over the empire wanted the chance to fight Spain, to join up with the Barbarossas, and perhaps, if they played their cards right, to regain their homes. It's possible that around this time they were joined by that young Jewish exile we mentioned earlier, Sinan. He would have still been a boy, and probably was still too young to join up, but perhaps old enough. However, many other young Jewish men did join the fleet. There were many motivations for all of the pirates that joined up, similar, some of them, to the pirates that would sail later in the Caribbean. There was the lust for gold, there was plunder and adventure and even revenge. But there was something more that drove all of these Jewish and Muslim sailors to join up with the Barbarossa fleet. See, the Catholic monarchs were expanding into Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia, and it was becoming a real problem for them. It was a war, and it was a war that, if the Catholic monarchs won, the Jews and Berber Muslims in North Africa would face real persecution, maybe an end to their way of life. See, the Spanish had captured fortifications and castles. They were getting a foothold, and it was going to be up to these corsairs to push them back. Next time, we're going to look at the opening moves of what was really a holy war that was being fought on the Mediterranean by these mujahideen and the warriors for Zion. We're going to follow Oruç and Khizr Barbarossa. We're going to follow Sinan the Chief, the Great Jew as he was called. We're going to follow Kurtuglu Mujahideen in his fight against Spain. We're going to follow all these privateers in their fight against Charles V and the entirety of the Holy Roman Empire. When Oruç and Khizr Barbarossa captured 2 papal galleys off the coast of Italy, it created a stir in Christendom. This appeared to be a different breed of Barbary pirate. For years there had been small boats rowing out of Berber ports looking for incautious Italian ships, but to sail deep into Italian territorial waters, in sight of Elba, and to capture 2 well-armed ships, 2 ships that belonged to the Pope himself, well, that was something new. Were I writing a story, I would use this moment to tell you that the governments of Italy all jumped into action. All the former Crusader kingdoms, from Spain to France to Prussia, would band together to fight this new menace to the south, but that is not at all what happened. See, Europe had much bigger fish to fry than a few measly Moorish pirates. They were at war, as Europe tended to be nearly all the time here in the High Middle Ages. Now, this wasn't a world-shaking conflict. Armies were clashing and soldiers were being killed to further the aims of powerful men, but it wasn't the 30 Years' War or even the 9 Years' War, and it certainly wasn't a Revolutionary or Napoleonic War. They were fighting the Italian War, or one of the Italian Wars. They had a lot of these. Basically, for nearly a century, the Italian city-states, the Papal States, and the Republic of Venice contested and conspired and warred and assassinated their way to controlling lands and controlling properties that they had not previously held. Every once in a while, the Pope or some duke or some prince would beg the aid of Spain or France or England or Prussia or Bavaria or wherever, and their king would send troops into Italy. See, it was a good testing ground. It was a good training ground for new troops and new battlefield commanders. The Italian countryside was also flowering and provided ample opportunities for noblemen in command to cheat on their wives and cuckold the local gentry. Common soldiers also found women to keep them company, but usually far less willing. The Spanish or the French or whoever spent most of their time filling their own coffers with stolen gold and killing a few local militiamen. In a lot of ways, it actually looked very similar to later pirate raids. But whatever Italian authority that had initially invited that foreign army in to fight on their side always saw how politically abysmal it looked to have foreigners riding on his side, literally raping and pillaging other Italians. So invariably that Italian nobleman would declare, "Curses, we've been fooled," and then he would switch sides and fight against the army that he invited in. They were living out a romantic fantasy. They were playing chess with real people, and those people suffered. There is a reason that in a couple of 100 years the guillotine was so liberally applied. So those pirate raids from the Barbary coast at first seemed like not that big a problem, more of the same, really. The Ottoman Empire was, in Hungary and Romania, actually fighting a real war of conquest, but the Moorish states were just starting to dip their toes into the seasonal conflicts that European lords were frequently engaging in. And those pirates were just that. They were pirates. which actually brings up a question I want to explore. It's really almost an underlying question to our entire show, but it's particularly prescient here. It's, what is a pirate? It seems simple, but it's really, in this case, a difficult question to answer. When does a pirate cross that line into a privateer? When does a privateer cross the line into a legitimate naval unit? It's a question that hangs on international laws, and there weren't sufficient international laws governing this stuff in 1500. In reverse, it's a simple answer. A naval man or a privateer crosses that line into piracy when a monarch decides it's politically expedient to disavow any actions taken by them. Had Queen Elizabeth buckled under the Spanish pressure, she may have ordered Francis Drake strung up at the docks, and we wouldn't have a Sir Francis Drake, but a moderately notorious pirate, Francis the Dragon. But that's a one-sided Anglo-centric view. Drake was a pirate in the eyes of Spain, and I would actually be curious to find out how he is seen, if he's talked about much at all, by the people of Mexico or Cuba or Panama or modern-day Spain. But keep that question in mind. What is a pirate? How do we choose to define them, especially in the West? And where do those lines between pirate and privateer lie? This is episode 76, The Brothers Barbarossa. The reason I bring up that question at all is, well, we've been trained to see pirates as sort of the good guys, rogues and anti-heroes, Robin Hood, Han Solo types, and there are sometimes reasons to see them that way. But there are even more good reasons to see them as drunken, homeless, dirty, violent, rapacious, and greedy. However, that is often less the case with the Barbary Pirates. At least in the West, they are typically portrayed one of two ways. In the old-fashioned view of European historians, they were violent, crazy-eyed, turban-wearing Mohammedan maniacs killing and raping and taking slaves, and they were that. They were violent, they did wear turbans, and they did pray facing Mecca every day, and they did kill and rape and enslave. But then there is a revisionist view that portrays them as a bunch of young, idealistic freedom fighters struggling against the might of Spain, and that is also true. They were young, and they were fighting for their ideals. They were struggling against the might of Spain and really the whole of the Catholic world. But I don't want to portray them as a plucky band of freedom fighters, and I have to struggle with that, because I love stories about plucky bands of freedom fighters. What they were, when we move past the prejudiced historians of old and the modern revisionists, was really just a successful naval mercenary group. They worked directly for the highest echelons of the Ottoman Empire. They were soldiers in an imperial and holy war, which distinguishes them from pirates like Blackbeard and puts them closer to the camp of Drake. That imperial war in question was a war between, on one side, Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire on the other. It was, or eventually would be, almost a personal contest, almost a game of chess between Charles V and Suleiman the Magnificent. And here is a good place to rejoin our story in 1504. That game of chess was progressing pretty evenly at the moment. See, if you were to look at a map of the Mediterranean and the lands surrounding it, and imagine the borders of Ottoman, or at least of Islamic control, versus Catholic control, you can watch those borders shift almost evenly. I picture a line, maybe not exactly a straight line, crossing the Mediterranean Sea, moving counterclockwise. At one point, the Caliphate of Cordoba controlled most of the Iberian Peninsula, and the Byzantine Empire controlled most of Anatolia, most of modern-day Turkey. But in the 1400s, that line shifted. Muslim Spain was pushed into Africa, and Byzantine Turkey was slowly consumed by the Ottomans. Then Greece fell into the hands of the Ottoman Sultan, and then the new nation of Spain started conquering and settling ports on the coast of Morocco and Algeria, pushing their winnings. And let me tell you this, it's basically useless to Google anything about Spain fighting Morocco and Tunisia in a world where soccer exists, especially in a World Cup year. But those initial Spanish conquests in North Africa were quick and relentless. They captured a number of strongholds on the African mainland and used them as ports for inland wars, but mostly to control the Mediterranean. They were able to take those ports with relative ease because, well, first of all, they were attacking independent caliphates. This wasn't the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, who in another time may have given these independent caliphates aid, well, they were busy fighting another war. There was an internal struggle going on, but also a war with Venice. These days, the Venetian Republic tends to get sort of ignored in the bustle of European history, at least here in the U.S. it seems to. But at the time, they were a sovereign state for almost a millennium, and they were a powerful one in Europe. They inherited much of what had been Rome's cultural history and most of her wealth. The Venetian Republic commanded the Aegean and the Ionian seas for centuries, and much of the Mediterranean. They played a major role in the Crusades, and they fostered many of the greatest minds of the Italian Renaissance. They were also the lords of Greece, so they had problems with the Turks taking Greece over. Now, Venice was at war with basically everyone here in 1504. On one side, to the east, there were the Ottomans pushing in Greece, and then on the other side, basically the rest of Europe. Spain, France, England, and most of the rest of Italy, including the Papal States, the Holy Roman Empire got in there, everyone. Remember last time when we talked about the Barbarossa brothers' patron, Seyzad Korkut, the son of the Sultan, the prince of the Ottoman Empire? Well, when Khizr and Oruç Barbarossa attacked those papal galleys off the coast of Elba, that created real problems for him. You see, it was well known across the empire that he was a patron of the Barbarossas. They attacked 2 papal galleys, 2 ships from the papal states, and the empire was at war with Venice, an enemy of the papal states. Now, it's not like the Pope and the Ottoman Empire were allies, far from it, but it's typically seen as a foolish move to steal funds that would likely go to fight your enemies, especially while antagonizing that same force that was busy fighting your enemy. This was one of a long line of perceived, often incorrectly perceived, screw-ups that Korkut oversaw. Have you ever been in a situation at work or at school in which you have an idea, a good idea, but it gets totally shot down by your boss or your teacher, and then a few weeks later or maybe a few months later, that boss or that teacher announces their own spectacular idea, and it's really just your idea? I encountered that in high school with the school paper. The editor and I clashed over a number of issues, but I was a demanding person who had a problem with authority, so I quit. But then, in the next issue, I saw nearly all of my suggestions that the editor had shot down implemented in the paper. Imagine a situation like that, only it's your father, not some teacher, not your boss, and it's international military policy, not a school newspaper. That was the situation that Korkut found himself in. After the Barbarossas attacked those galleys, and after Korkut had to suffer the political fallout, the Ottoman Empire ended their war with Venice and went to war with the Papal States. But this really only, at this point, affected Korkut. The brothers weren't too intertwined in politics, at least not yet. They were still just privateers and not beholden to the Ottoman Empire or their guidelines. At this point, they were working for the Emir of Djerba, and the Emir was far more concerned with Spain in his waters than with Italy. That's why, later in 1504, Oruç Barbarossa sailed out to capture yet another important ship. This time, in the waters southwest of Spain, they captured a Sicilian galley, the Cavalleria, carrying Spanish foot soldiers and knights to the tune of 440 men. That's 440 soldiers, plus Sicilian sailors, all of whom were now galley slaves. This action coincided well with the Ottoman Empire's policy concerning Spain. They had been focused on Venice after their conquest of Greece and the Aegean, but now that Spain was moving further and further south and east, They couldn't afford to ignore Spain any longer, or to leave the defense of Muslim shores in the hands of privateers. The Sultan sent the admiral of the Mediterranean Ottoman fleet, which at the time was virtually the entire Ottoman fleet, a man named Kemal Rais, west to help defend Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria. Kemal Rais brought his nephew, a man who would go on to become a famed mapmaker named Ahmed Piri. Kemal's surname, Rais, is an Ottoman naming convention that we're going to run into quite a bit while we discuss these Barbary pirates. It's a declaration of his rank as captain. It's basically calling him Captain Kemal. Now, Kemal raided Spanish port cities all along the African coast. He didn't conquer them, but he did a fair amount of damage, very similar to how pirates in the 1700s would. He attacked naval squadrons on patrol out in the sea, and then he passed through the Pillars of Hercules and harassed the Atlantic coast of Iberia. This was all-out naval warfare, far beyond the privateering of the Barbarossa brothers. His presence made things a bit too tense in the western Mediterranean. Spain was sending more and more ships out to deal with Kemal and his fleet. So Baba Oruç decided to turn away from privateering and went back to transporting refugees and smuggling. The Barbarossa brothers, though, were, after their 2 successful raids, beginning to gather followers. Mostly the younger brother, Khizr. There was another Greek Ottoman sailor turned privateer who was close to Khizr. His name was Kurtuglu Muzlahedin. Kurtuglu means son of the wolf. Now, he may actually have known the Barbarossas before he became a privateer, but we don't know much about his early life until he joined the privateer fleet. However, it was clear that he was Khizr's man more than anyone else's. It was probably around this time as well that the young Sephardi Jewish sailor named Sinan joined up with the Barbarossas. At the time, probably just as a crew member, not yet a commander, but he would have been in the mix. Then, the eldest of the Barbarossa brothers, Ishak, went to Djerba as well. He didn't at first engage in privateering. He managed things on the island. He basically ran the family business, which was privateering rather than pottery, but soon enough he had turned to sailing as well. And then there was that nephew of the Ottoman admiral, Ahmed Piri. He joined up with the fleet of the Barbarossas as well. These 5 young men, well, at least the 4 young men, perhaps excluding Sinan, who we aren't certain had joined up at this point, but this group of privateers defined Ottoman naval strategy going forward, as well as Barbary piracy for decades to come. If one chose to do so, they could call this group the Young Turks. Now, they would be incorrect. None of them were actually Turkish, after all. Ishak, Oruç, and Khizr, the Barbarossas, were of Greek and Armenian heritage. Sinan was a Sephardi Jew from Spain, and Ahmed was Anatolian but of Greek lineage. But remember about a month ago we put out an episode called These New Turks? There was a Spanish governor that wrote about the Pacific pirates and called them the New Turks. That governor was actually referencing these pirates right here. Most importantly, Oruç, Khizr, Sinan, and Kurtuglu. When most Spaniards thought about pirates, even after Francis Drake and Henry Morgan and all of the French privateers, they still thought about Turks. Not just the Barbarossas and their fleet. There were decades of Moorish Barbary corsairs to come. But this group of turbaned, Jewish, Muslim, scimitar-wielding pirates were the definitive image of pirates and piracy in Spain, even by 1680. Even moving forward, in a lot of Europe, even today, that remains the case. That fleet, the privateer fleet under Oruç Barbarossa, was the most attractive opportunity for any young Ottoman seafarer. Philip Goss writes in The History of Piracy, quote, Oruç's sensational exploits attracted to him all the adventurers of the southern and eastern Mediterranean, as well as a large number of renegades from different countries. His appeal was as strong as that of Drake to the youth of Devon and Cornwall. Imitators also sprang up, and soon the Mediterranean was infested from end to end with the companies of freebooters. End quote. A year after the capture of the Cavalleria in 1505, Oruç Barbarossa led a fleet through the Strait of Gibraltar into the Atlantic Ocean. The other ships in the fleet were commanded by Ishak, Khizr, and Kartuglu, as well as perhaps Ahmed Piri and Sainan. That little fleet caused some amount of trouble along the coast, but they soon spotted a galleon sailing in from the Atlantic toward Spanish shores. The Spanish galleon had only recently been invented. It was a relatively new design, and it was a ship about which any pirate would be wary. However, Oruç thought this ship was worth trying for. The former Navy SEAL, Binnerson Little, writes in his Tactical History of Piracy how history's greatest pirates pillaged, plundered, and got away with it, quote, "They hoisted their true colors, probably Tunisian, and the Islamic crescent created even more fear. Within 100 yards they opened fire, sending harquebus lead and arrows into the exposed crew. Confusion reigned as the bowspur of the corsair galley slipped over the extended oars and pierced the outrigger. The corsairs surged over the spur and aboard the prey vessel, their scimitars in hand, their voices shouting Allah and hurling war cries and promises of bloody slaughter. They gave no quarter to anyone. Both victor and victim were covered in blood as the naked blades rang against opposing arms and armor, as sharp steel carved flesh from bone and limb from body. The broad strokes of the Turkish scimitars cut easily, for their sharply curved blades were made for such cutting." End quote. And that brings up a point of interest here. These Barbary pirates had some of the best weapons in the world. Their guns were still lacking, but the Arabic and Berber bows were some of the best recurve bows in the world, and their swords were Damascus steel scimitars. That Spanish galleon, that impressive warship, eventually begged quarter from the privateers, and the survivors were captured and enslaved and made to work oars. That Spanish galleon held a new kind of plunder, though, something that none of the Barbary corsairs had ever seen before. She was carrying a king's ransom in Spanish silver pieces of 8. It was a treasure galleon. They had almost accidentally happened across the treasure galleon, if we believe the Spanish. King Ferdinand, after this little event, decided it would be best to cut a deal with the pirates and privateers. He had much bigger problems elsewhere to deal with, mostly in Italy, so he paid off the Barbary corsairs, Oruç and Khizr and all the rest, and he actually talked them into attacking his enemies, the Italians. They focused their attentions on the Italian ships for several years. They made a fortune attacking Sicily and Venice and any Italian ship that crossed their paths, and every time they successfully raided a town or a city or a ship, that brought them greater wealth and greater renown. But then in 1510, Spain started pushing her claims on the Berber coast. Kemal Rais had stopped the advance of the Spanish forces, but soon it became apparent that Spain was now going to be a threat to the pirates' home at Djerba. Ferdinand sent in a fleet that eclipsed anything the Ottomans possessed, mostly Spanish galleons, and that surpassed any ship that the Berbers or the Ottomans could float. That Spanish fleet took Bougia, Oran, and the city of Algiers. These were the 3 largest Mediterranean port cities in Algeria, and Ferdinand consolidated his control of them with island fortresses that guarded any approach. The Algerian emir courted the Barbarossa brothers and their fleet to help him liberate his coast from King Ferdinand. Oruç and Khizr agreed, and they set sail from Djerba to do so. This was not privateering, this was not piracy, this was mercenary work for an emir of an independent caliphate. Their first attempt was to take that first city of Bougia in 1511. The Spanish, though, were ready. They fired volley after volley from their island fortress of heavy cannon fire at the incoming pirates. Before they even got in range, Oruç and Khizr were repelled. Oruç was seriously wounded in that barrage of cannon fire. His right arm was damaged by a cannonball and had to be amputated at sea. He was, when he returned to Djerba, given a prosthesis made of pure silver, which he regularly polished, according to legend, to reflect the sun and blind his enemies. And he was, after his new arm was put on, given a new nickname. He was already Baba, or Rouge, for his shepherding of the Muslim and Jewish exiles. He was Barbarossa for his fiery red beard. And now he was Gumus Kal, in Arabic, silver arm. The fleet returned to take the city in 1512, but once again to no avail. This campaign against Spain wasn't proceeding well, so they just decided to go capture some Spanish outposts elsewhere. They raided up and down the Andalusian coast of Spain in a brutal campaign. They would appear suddenly out of nowhere, seize a fishing village or a coastal town, and carry off all of the valuables and slaves in the town. These slaves captured on the Andalusian coast were not intended for the galleys, and they weren't to work the oars. They captured young men and women as well as girls and boys, and they had the intention of selling them to the harem masters, everywhere from Morocco to Alexandria to Damascus. The men and boys were worth less in resale value in the Ottoman Empire than the women and girls, and their cargo space was limited on their galleys, so thousands of women were captured in those few months of raiding along the coast of Spain. Now, Oruç, the admiral of their pirate fleet, may not have been behind these raids. See, he was always more interested in politics than anything else. The interests of his family and the empire were always at the center of his mind. But his leadership against the Spanish fortresses along the Barbary coast had netted the pirates nothing. They had been failures, and they'd lost many men. So his younger brother, Khizr Barbarossa, Khizr was always more of a pirate and less of a politician. He was a loose cannon, a hothead, but he usually led the men into battle, and he always got results. He also made the men a lot of money. Spanish silver suddenly flowed into Djerba, into the pockets of all of the Barbary corsairs, and it spent everywhere. It appears that Khizr was behind these raids on the coast of Spain, while Oruç was recuperating from his wound. And Khizr's tactics were unpredictable. He would attack a village without warning and then back out to sea, and he would skip by leagues and leagues of coastline to attack an island hundreds of kilometers away. And sometimes he would occupy the castle on that island just for the purpose of sinking any Spanish ships that sailed by. When Spain finally got their act together and finally sent out some ships to capture him, Khizr disappeared. And then he would reappear, all his slaves sold off outside Genoa, where he would raid the estates of the aristocracy along the Riviera. And then, when the Genoese navy got their act together and sent a fleet out to capture Khizr and his men, the Barbary corsairs captured 23 of their warships in under a month. He became a boogeyman to the Mediterranean coast of Europe. He could appear anywhere without warning and carry away your daughter and all of your money. But think about that for a moment. 23 of the best Genoese warships in their fleet in under a month. Put yourself in the shoes of a pirate who suddenly had dozens of ships under their command. Venetian galleys with Venetian flags and Venetian uniforms and Venetian guns. Genoese yachts and warships with Genoese flags and Genoese uniforms and Genoese guns, and at least one powerful Spanish galleon with Spanish flags and Spanish uniforms and Spanish guns. If you were a successful pirate with further larceny in mind, how would you utilize those resources? It's not a difficult equation, but they did have two problems. First, they didn't have enough men to man all of those vessels, so they recruited heavily from the Sephardi population of Djerba and Anatolia. If young Sinan had not yet joined the Barbary corsairs, he did so here. The Jewish pirates that joined up with this fleet were a serious help to the Barbary corsairs. Remember, most of the Barbary corsair ships were those galleots. They were oar-powered vessels with a single sail. But these European Jews had knowledge of maps and charts and naval tools that the Barbary corsairs didn't. Not only did they know how to sail better than the Berbers, who were used to their galleots, they also spoke fluent Spanish. They'd grown up speaking it in Spain. And they looked Spanish. At least they looked more European than the typical Ottoman janissary or Moorish warrior. So after their brutal campaigns in Spain and Italy, the Barbarossas found themselves positioned to become the most powerful and influential naval force in the Mediterranean. Now, I know that's a bold claim, but remember, Spain, who was easily the most powerful navy in the world, was focusing most of their attention on the Western Hemisphere, the New World, the Americas. England and the Netherlands still didn't have much of a fleet to speak of, and frankly, neither did the Ottoman Empire. This fleet of privateers realized suddenly to itself that they may be the most powerful force out there. But they did have one other problem. They had all of those captured ships and guns. They were high-quality European guns, but they only had some powder and some shot for them, not really enough to last. And Djerba at the time didn't have the infrastructure to make gunpowder. So Oruç, who was interested not just in piracy but also in building up his home, sent off to Greece and Anatolia for the necessary materials to build a gunpowder manufactory. With this new facility, with all of the funds they had from selling enslaved concubines, and with that ship full of Spanish silver, well, they had a near-endless supply of high-quality powder and shot. Now, this was important for their pirate fleet, but it also turned out that powder and shot in the Ottoman Empire made them a nice profit. So they had all of these new men, those Sephardi recruits, those Berber recruits, those Ottoman recruits. They had new ships to the tune of about 30 vessels, and they had all of the new weapons and a steady supply of gunpowder and shot. That gave the commander of the fleet, Oruç Barbarossa, the opportunity to return to the fray, to return to his war against Spain. This time, better prepared, their campaign went far better. They defeated a Spanish naval squadron out on the sea. They captured the galleons and the cannon in that squadron, and they even took 4 English vessels that were on their way through the Mediterranean to France. And I should mention that they weren't keeping all of the ships that they took. They were taking lots and lots of ships during this period. If they had taken every ship that they took, they would have had dozens of large ships and been in need of thousands of men to crew them. They did have maybe 2,000 sailors, but not nearly enough to sail all of the new vessels. However, the Ottoman Empire did have thousands of sailors, Muslim and Jewish sailors. So the Barbarossas sold their excess vessels to the Ottomans, as well as any slaves that they captured, and made a tidy profit off of that as well. That's why these Barbary corsairs were perhaps luckier and perhaps smarter than later pirates. They not only captured money that they needed to live, but they went on raids that advanced themselves politically and financially. The corsairs went on to capture Spanish-held forts at Churchill, Ceuta, and Gijel. These were 3 ports deep in Spanish territory. They established bases there, and even though the Spanish would eventually chase them out of the first 2, Churchill and Ceuta, that dealt real blows to Spanish power in North Africa. Then, an emissary arrived at the Barbary fortress at Gijel from an Ottoman commander. And this is one of those moments that needs to be imagined. It needs to be visualized. At least, when I read about it, I see it vividly. Gijel lies on the coast of the Mediterranean. If you look up pictures of it, it looks sunny and warm. The waters that lap the shores of Gijel are clear blue-green. The coast is lined with beaches and date trees, and hovering over the city is the fortress that was inhabited by Oruç Barbarossa. That fortress was an old sandstone Berber fortification on cliffs that overlooked the sea and guarded a bay around which Gijel was situated. Inside, the walls of the fortress were lined by sumptuous tapestries, some of them of Ottoman or Berber origin, but many of them stolen from aristocratic estates in Spain and France and Italy. The floors were covered in Greek carpets, and the sounds of birds chirping and waves lapping and ships creaking filled the halls of the fortress. When that Ottoman emissary arrived in the central hall, there were probably 4 men there awaiting him. There was Kurtuglu, the son of the wolf, whose father had been a famous sailor. I imagine him entertaining one of the many scantily clad foreign women attending the privateer captains. Then there was Ahmed Piri, the nephew of the Ottoman admiral of the Mediterranean. I imagine him wearing spectacles and looking over his maps. He was, at the time, busy compiling maps from India and China and Europe and the New World to create an atlas of the entire world. His atlas would be the most complete collection of world maps created in centuries, and it would be the first collection in what we might consider the modern world. And then there was Khizr, with a full red beard, young, perhaps younger than the rest of them, and with dangerous eyes. He was probably wearing a linen shirt with sleeves rolled to his elbows. There would have been a leather vest, sandals, dyed woolen pants, and I imagine him sharpening his scimitar, or perhaps a dagger, and maybe reading a book. And then, in the center of the room, not tall, but remarkably broad-shouldered and sturdy, with just a hint of gray entering his red hair, in rich brocaded robes with a gleaming silver arm, was Baba Oruç. The Ottoman emissary had news for the four corsairs. The Caliph of Algeria had finally relented and asked for Ottoman aid against Spain. The emissary likely wouldn't have come out and said it, but there was an insinuation here. If the Caliph of the independent Kingdom of Algeria had begged aid from the Sultan, he would have agreed to concessions with the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Algeria would stay nominally independent, but would become in effect a member state of the ever-expanding Ottoman Empire. The Sultan, Selim I, sent out the admiral and military commander Selim ed-Tayumi to be the actual power in Algeria, the power behind the throne, so to speak. The emissary sent to the corsairs had been sent from the new emir, Selim ed-Tayumi, to recruit Barbarossa and his followers to their fleet in the Ottoman attempt to end the blockade and the siege of the city of Algiers. This was a key moment in Oruç's overarching plan. There was probably debate among the four privateers, probably discussion, but whether or not anyone wanted to do this, it was Oruç's will, and he would have been insistent. So they sent off that emissary with promises that they would join Selim in battle against Spain in the Battle for Algiers. Oruç Barbarossa sailed off with the 5,000 best warriors, land-based warriors, to be found in any of the cities or lands that he commanded. He made landfall to march on Algiers in tandem with the Ottoman forces. Khizr Barbarossa and Kurtulgu organized the rest of the fleet, and they took the 1,000 best corsairs they had to set sail. 3 different forces moved on Algiers in tandem in 1516. There was the main Ottoman army under Selim, the elite forces under Oruç, which were expert in infiltration and capturing fortresses, and then there was the privateer navy under Khizr and Kurtulgu. Details of this battle are relatively scarce, but it appears that it was quick. Apparently, the sudden appearance of an overwhelming Islamic force was enough to convince the Spaniards besieging Algiers to leave. Within a day, the single most important port in the southwestern Mediterranean now belonged to the Ottoman Empire. For about a day, maybe less. Accounts differ on what happened next, but my favorite comes from Philip Goss. He writes, quote, Oruç marched to Algiers at the head of 5,000, while his brother, the terrible Khayr ed-Din, was soon to succeed and surpass him, followed with the fleet. On his arrival, Oruç, perhaps impressed with the difficulties of a divided sovereignty, strangled Selim with his own hands and became the master of the place, nominally as the vassal of the Sultan of Turkey. End quote. See, Selim, the man who was meant to rule Algiers, was a member of the Ottoman Empire, but he brought in the Barbarossas and their fleet and their forces as mercenaries. Say you were the most powerful man in the world, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. If you had picked a commander to lead a liberation force, and then one of the mercenaries he hired murdered him and took control of the city, well, would you accept the rule of those mercenaries in the most important port in the entire region? The problem here comes in part from the source that I quoted. He said that they strangled Selim with their own hands, but that might be hyperbolic or even mythological. The commander might have been recalled to Istanbul, or he might have died naturally, or he might have died in the battle. However, even if what Goss wrote was absolute truth, any pragmatic sultan would at least consider giving control of Algiers to a powerful, charismatic soldier with thousands of his own soldiers you don't have to pay, and a fleet that you don't have to pay at his command. Selim I, the Ottoman Sultan, was not tremendously pragmatic. There was a moment after the conquest of Algiers where the Barbarossa brothers and their fleet and their soldiers were at odds with the Ottoman Empire, and it looked like the Ottoman Empire might go to war with the Barbarossas. However, Selim I didn't have long left to rule, and his son and successor, a young man named Suleiman, was noted for his political acumen and realistic worldview. The Barbarossas, in control of Algiers, were not yet Ottoman subjects, and Algiers was not yet an Ottoman territory. But in 1516, when Oruç and Khizr took the city of Algiers, there was another pragmatic ruler entering the scene. That year he became King Charles of Spain and was soon to be Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. It was something of a national crisis back in Spain when they lost Algiers. It was central to the control of the North African coast, and it was going to be King Charles' first major test to see how he would deal with and hopefully destroy the Moorish pirates that had taken Algiers. Next time, we're going to look at the city of Algiers and the fleet and forces of the brothers Barbarossa when war breaks out between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Ottoman Sultan. Regarding the question that I asked at the beginning of today's episode, what is a pirate and how do the Barbarossa brothers fit in the story of piracy? To me, Oruç Barbarossa was never a pirate. He was an occasional privateer, but he was a man who had ambitions beyond the sea. His younger brother, Khizr, on the other hand, was the epitome of piracy. Plunder, pillage, attack. He loved the sea, and he spent much time on it, even though he was never regarded as a particularly good sailor. But now, they both had questions to ask. Was Oruç merely the commander of a mercenary company? Or, now that he was in command of Algiers, was he something more? Was he a ruler? Khizr had equal questions to ask. Could he still be a pirate, or did he now have to become someone respectable